amazing John Worthington. John's going to talk to you about the future of technology and music.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess it's a sign that I'm getting old when I start looking at the list of things I've done, because it always seems to be way longer. At the point in time when I was starting off, I was really a frustrated poor musician, which I'm sure some of you can relate with. Everyone here okay? All right, great. So my problem was music technology of any sort was really expensive. To give you an idea, the Yamaha CS80, which just came out in a $179 plug-in, it sounds really good, was a $20,000 synthesizer. And I actually ended up working for one of the first Guitar Center stores just so I could play with the synthesizer. That was the only way to get my hands on that stuff. And so at that point in time, the thing that made the most sense in the world was I was good with computers. You'd start working on trying to sort of do this stuff with computers, find ways to save money. So that led to a lot of the early work with MIDI. Because MIDI meant I didn't need to have a big tape deck. Pro Tools came about the same way. Big analog tape decks were really expensive, and it was sort of the natural outgrowth of samplers. And QuickTime was a little bit different story. I'm going to go through some of this just to give you a little perspective on how my mind works for when I get into the other stuff. Long about 1988, George Harrison went into a recording studio, and he happened to notice that there was a Macintosh there. And they were using it for doing some sample editing and some sequencing. And he remembered this deal that Apple Corps, which was the company the Beatles started to handle the publishing, had made with Apple Computer back in 1980. And back in those days, you have to remember that Apple Corps was this big company everyone had heard of. And Apple Computer was this little startup that no one had heard of. And it turns out that in the United Kingdom, the trademark category for personal computers was the same category for stereos. So the way trademarks work, you get the right to use a name in a particular product category. And this meant that Apple Computer, in fact, couldn't call themselves Apple Computer in the United Kingdom and in some parts of Europe. So they signed this sort of stupid deal, looking back on it, that said they wouldn't build a computer specifically for music reproduction, right? Because in those days, if a computer made sound at all, it was this, cheap little synthesizer, or maybe the beeps, you've heard coming out when you hit a keyboard, hit the wrong keystroke. So that went along fine, so George Harrison sees this Macintosh and realized that here's this Apple computer being used to make music. So their lawyers call Apple lawyers, and the next thing you know, they're suing Apple Computer for $330 million, which was just an absurd amount of money. And this goes to emphasize the point that, I can't emphasize enough about music business, which is, if anyone ever has to sue anyone, the lawyers are the only people who make money. So unless you're planning to go on to law school, you just ought to avoid the whole, getting sued thing, because it just doesn't pay, even if you're on the winning end. And if Apple Corps had asked for $3 million or $10 million, or buy a copy of a Beatles CD to stick in every computer, Apple probably would have done it. But $330 million was, a lot of money. And they went ahead and decided to fight it. And the first thing they did was they killed every project inside of Apple that had anything to do with music or sound. So the MIDI manager went on hold, the sound manager went on hold. I had the great pleasure of getting this big bound book of testimony from the Royal High Court in London, that they pointed out copies of all this stuff that sits around forever in the Tower of London. And here in like 90-point font is the splash screen from the MIDI manager with my name, which could be sort of terrifying when you're, 27, 28, and going, oh man, I am in big trouble. So what they ended up doing with me and my team is saying, audio and video are kind of the same thing. They both play back over time. They have to be synchronized. Video isn't very interesting if it doesn't have audio with it. So we'll put those guys on video projects. Now at that point in time, I knew very little about video. I was a musician who had learned recording technology and sort of prepped along with what the state of the art was, because it was all getting developed around me in the Bay Area. And here I was doing video stuff. So we had a project that was doing a plug-in card that would let you work with analog video on a Macintosh. The guys in the system software group had this project that was playing back frames of animation really fast on a computer. And then there were guys in the research lab who were doing something. We were never quite sure what. But they had this grand plan that at one point we were going to unify like all media types together in this unified language so you could talk about it all as the same thing. And Bruce Leak, who is the person running the system software effort, myself realized that we could in fact take over all the media projects at Apple if we decided to work together. And so we did, and we were having a grand time, playing back video on the computer, starting to capture stuff, doing what turned into QuickTime. And there was this crazy vice president at Apple who announced a media project called QuickTime. They had no people working on it. But he, stomped his fist at a sales meeting and said, we will have this media architecture in a year. So QuickTime really came out of them taking our work and deciding that it was the thing he had promised, even though there wasn't anything sort of planned that way. And that's really the history of most of the developments in music technology. DigiDesign didn't get started to make recording easier. It got started because the two founders of DigiDesign had a band, and they had bought an EMU drum emulator, and they thought the sound sucked. So Peter Gocher and Evan Brooks started thinking, gee, could we change the sounds in the drum chips? Evan was a good engineer. They figured out a way to do it, and all of a sudden people started buying their drum chips. Well, then they needed a way to edit the samples on the computer, and that's where Sound Designer came from. And a lot of the stuff I was doing with timing work in MIDI found its way into Studio Vision, and because Opcode was across the parking lot from DigiDesign, and they were about a mile from my house, we'd go have dinner every night. At a certain point, everyone decided, it'd be kind of cool if you could do your MIDI and audio stuff together. But it was all sort of this combination of I don't want to say accidents, because it was maybe a little more planned than that, but it was just people who, were passionate about what they were doing and happened to all be in the same area and decided to work together on it. And at that point in time, there wasn't enough money in media technology that any of the companies worried about it. It'd be kind of hard to do it now because all the companies are paranoid about people working together, and they're paranoid about their projects. But fortunately, late 80s, wonderful time, all this stuff got done. And the end result of it is what you have now, where instead of needing an expensive 24-track tape machine, any personal computer you can go buy will give you 24 tracks of CD quality audio. And to sort of put in perspective how miraculous that is, DigiDesign had a product called Sound Tools, which was the precursor to Pro Tools. And this did 2 tracks of CD quality audio. 2 tracks, $15,000, and we had to hand test the disk drives that went out with it. Because out of the pool of really fast disk drives, some were faster than others, and you needed to have these special disk drives to make it work. As opposed to now, where you can go down to, CompUSA, spend $49, and get a drive fast enough for doing, 24, 32 tracks of audio. You've got, things like GarageBand that, comes free with a Macintosh that gives you more studio horsepower than, was in the original Synclaviers, which were $250,000. So it's a pretty great time in one sense because the technology has removed one of the big constraints in making music. And that is all this recording gear being expensive. Right? Not a big deal now.